When you think Mel Powell, you don't initially think of this Pulitzer Prize winning composer. You think of this 14-year-old boy who grew up by a different birth name, playing in nightclubs, and really a kid like any other with aspirations to be a baseball player of all things. And for goodness sake, you could see Yankee Stadium from his house from where he grew up as a child. You don't think Pulitzer Prize. You think played with the Glenn Miller Band and Benny Goodman. And you think of an educator more than anything else. The man spent 40 years plus of his very successful career teaching at all sorts of institutes, including Yale, and is the founding dean of the California School of the Arts. For the longest time, as a child, he dreamt of being a musician as a concert pianist, and those aspirations quickly changed when his older brother took him to see a jazz pianist by the name of Teddy Wilson play. And Mel Powell speaks to this a little later in his career about how when that experience happened, how it was something that he had never heard before, and he was immediately hooked, and it's why he ended up playing in these nightclubs as a kid and ended up arranging a lot, as is the jazz way. And he found himself in this compositional world, and he never left it. And later on in his education, he started delving into this more atonal kind of world, and he called it non-tonal. Duplicates, which is Powell's Pulitzer Prize winning piece, dates back to his time serving in the war as a piano player and arranger for Glenn Miller's Army Air Force Band. And he tells this magnificent story of his time in Paris, of how he was talking to a musician who knew Debussy, and over a glass of wine had discussed the question of, do you know what would be the perfect kind of music? And Debussy had said an unending cadenza. And ever since that idea, Mel Powell, especially when he started really deeply studying composition and this atonal world that he would soon predominantly compose in while he was at Yale studying with Paul Heinzsmith, is when Mel Powell would say the quote of, "I've abandoned any pretense of sophistication about this being composition," and he's saying that he was thrilled and he planned on enjoying it. And Duplicates is the representation of that idea. Duplicates was commissioned by Betty Freeman, who was a patron of the avant-garde music for the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra. And this was commissioned in 1987, I believe. And it took Powell the better part of 2 years to compose this piece, and he regularly speaks of how he ran into complications with the writing. A degenerative muscle disease in his hand actually made it very difficult for him to play piano at the time, and he's actually quite optimistic about this fact. And when he talks about the piece, he explains how he's constantly running into trouble with the way that he wants it to develop, because the greatest thing about it is there really is no point in the piece where you say this is development. His goal was this Debussy quote of creating an ongoing big old cadenza, and he wrote it for two pianos with the intention that the Philharmonic's pianists would who at the time would play it and conduct it. And when he was showing the preliminary sheets to them, one of them actually laughed and said there's no way that one could successfully play this music and conduct it to an orchestra at the same time. So we went through a lot of changes with the piece, and constantly tells of how, I mean, he didn't expect it to be anything more than a commissioned piece for the orchestra. This piece is incredibly complex, and with the two piano parts, as he said, being equally complicated and layered and often written in 3 separate lines just so you can see the motion of it, we get this very, very eerie sound that comes from it. And Mel Powell was particularly insistent on the fact that a listener be very aware that how the moving lines worked between the two pianos, and then ultimately how the orchestra played into that in these eerie sort of sounds. Like, that's the wrong music. I know I have it somewhere in here. Let's hope I don't forget to cut that out. An excerpt from Mel Powell's Duplicates, piano 2 part. Not gonna lie, that probably took me more than an hour to be able to play it. And it's not... the two piano parts being referred to as being of equal prominence to each other when playing together, especially in this sort of call and response, sequential establishment of sequential themes and motives. When playing with the orchestra, create this kind of interplay that makes, as I said earlier, this really eerie sort of sound, or as Powell puts it, this non-tonal idea of listening. And it all goes back to that moment in his service in World War II, in, I believe it was Paris, when he met the musician who talked about Debussy as referring to the perfect music being an ongoing cadenza of playing, and this very kind of virtuosic piano playing. that idea of perfect music, according to Debussy, as being that ongoing cadential kind of music. Cadential? That's not the word.